from Afghanistan, Georgia, Rwanda, and South Africa. I'm Jenna Slotin, the Policy Director of the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes I want to go over for anyone who's not familiar with the Kudo platform. We will have simultaneous interpretation into English, French, and Portuguese. So you can select your preferred language by going to the menu on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. When you logged in, it should be set to floor, which is the language of the person presently speaking. If you click on the arrow, you can see the other language selections that you can choose, and feel free to change or switch back and forth as you need. We'll be taking questions in the chat box. So the small round gray icon that says messaging. You're welcome to put your questions in there whenever you like. You don't need to wait until speakers are finished. We'll be collecting those questions in the background, and I'll be relaying them back to the speakers as we go. With Kudo, it's best to use Google Chrome. So if you're having any problems and you're not using Google Chrome, you could switch browsers, and you can always just refresh your page in Google Chrome to improve the results. I think that is all the housekeeping notes. And so now let's get started with the webinar itself. It's a great pleasure to be co-hosting this webinar with the Center of Excellence for Civil Registration and Vital Statistics Systems at the International Development Research Center. The Center of Excellence is a leading player in the CRVS and identity space, advancing critical research and bringing diverse perspectives to the table on key issues and challenges, as well as what works at the country level. We from the Global Partnership at Sustainable Development Data, we're a network of over 250 partners united around the goal of improving the production, access, and use of data to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, of which civil registration and vital statistics are an essential part. Primarily with this webinar, looking at SDG target 16.9. So this analysis around CRVS and learning that the Center of Excellence facilitates is critical to reach target 16.9 on legal identity for all, and to ensure that everyone is counted and can access basic services and benefits. And this is becoming ever more important in the digital age, where the COVID-19 pandemic has led all people to rely even more heavily on digital services that require identity authentication. I'm very much looking forward to hearing how these 4 different countries have adapted their legal, regulatory, and institutional frameworks after periods of immense upheaval to improve registration of vital events and provide legal identity even to non-citizens. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our introductory speaker, Montasser Kamal. Montasser is the program leader of Health Research Partnerships, which houses the Center of Excellence for Civil Registration and Vital Statistics Systems at the Global Health Division at the International Development Research Center. He has also worked at the Global Health Division at Canada's before IDRC, Montasser was the Deputy Director for Global Health Policy and Research at Global Affairs Canada. And he's also worked at the former Canadian International Development Agency as the team leader of health specialists and the Senior Program Officer for Reproductive Health and HIV/AIDS at the Regional Office of the Ford Foundation in Cairo. Over to you, Montasser.
Thanks so much, Jenna. It's my pleasure to be here with everyone today. This has been work in the making for quite some time, so it's very exciting for us to be here to have this opportunity to listen to our speakers today. J'ai le grand plaisir de vous souhaiter la bienvenue aujourd'hui. Merci de nous avoir.
To wish you welcome today and to have you in this webinar and to share what we intend to do to construct legal identity in the context of the conflict. 2 experts in their domain, Mia Harbitz and Diane Hubbard, will present.
most of you are aware, the estimated numbers of persons without legal identity are staggering in the millions and hundreds of millions. Globally, tens of millions of people have no registered legal identity. Most of these people belong to the world's most marginalized and vulnerable groups, including refugees, migrants, and internally displaced persons. In many countries, getting children registered immediately after birth is still a challenge. It is not a right that is fulfilled every day. There are at least 237 million children under the age of 5 without a birth certificate. A life without documentation is likely to make these children's lives more difficult, even more difficult in the future. In modern society, a legal identity and trusted legal credentials are often necessary for benefiting from health and education services and social protection measures. It is also essential for political participation and can help with opening a bank account or getting a loan to start a business. Moreover, the older a child gets, the more difficult it becomes for the authorities to establish a trustworthy identity and family relations. The purpose of this presentation today and the paper that the presentation is based on is to contribute to the global and regional discussions on countries' capacities to provide legal identity for all, regardless of citizenship status within their national territory as set out by the Sustainable Development Goal 16.9. The paper that will be presented today explores the key determinants for establishing trusted legal identities in post-conflict settings, where large numbers of the populations have not been registered by birth and might distrust the authorities. It is part of the mandate of the Center of Excellence for Civil Registration and Vital Statistics Systems to fill the knowledge gap in the field of CRVS, and we're proud to contribute to broadening our understanding of legal underpinnings for the establishment of legal identity for all, as well as documenting operational modalities and models that either enable or hinder registration of vital events, particularly in post-conflict settings. The civil registry, or in some cases the National Population Register, is generally the basis for establishing legal identity. The ability to register everyone depends on the legal framework, but also the capacity, management, functional structure of the agency that is responsible for the registration. Civil registers are crucial functions of public administration and governance as they support the delivery of essential public sector services through validating and verifying identities and recording the biographic information on which legal identity is based. Therefore, the success of a civil registry depends on other governmental institutions' acceptance of the issued identity, credential, and data. The identity, data, and credentials it issues must be highly trusted. This can be a challenge in countries that are emerging from conflict, as little evidence exists of people's identity data. Many people do not have any documents. Others have multiple documents with different identities, sometimes names spelled differently or in different orders or different names altogether. And of course, then there are those who intentionally conceal their real identity and create a new one for surviving during the years of conflict. And we have seen that in many situations throughout the recent history. I remind you that identity, credentials, and data have been the heart, drivers, or enablers of many conflicts. Identity has been politicized and used to incite violence, which is all the more important why we should pay close attention to the issue of identity management during conflict and post-conflict situations. During conflict, registration and identification processes often are significantly slowed, with large numbers of births not registered. At times, large numbers of institutional records can be lost or destroyed. The conflict results in significant movement of populations within and across borders. And once a conflict ends, many people seek to return home, and their identity may need to be established or re-established. This paper analyzes the role of the civil registry and the legal underpinnings for establishing identity in 4 countries: Afghanistan, Georgia, Rwanda, and South Africa. These countries have all experienced conflict in their recent histories and have since made tremendous progress, providing legal identity for all, through, amongst other things, revising or rewriting their legal framework to ensure a more secure path to legal identity for all. The paper also describes institutional and operational models in each of these countries, different pathways to provide legal identity universally through developing processes for dealing with backlogs of unregistered births and groups that are typically harder to reach. Particularly fascinating is that the reconstructing and rebuilding of these identity systems have been part of the reconciliation process in some of the studied countries. The Center of Excellence is also hopeful that the paper will provide guidance to policymakers and professionals working in the field of civil registration and identity management by analyzing and describing the building and reconstructing of civil registries in post-conflict settings, highlighting the challenges countries can experience and how some countries have shaped and rebuilt their systems so civil registration and identity management addresses and supports their nation building processes. There is no one-size-fits-all model. Each country has to find its own pathway, but examples can provide us with sources for reflection and inspiration. The studied countries have recognized that civil registration and issuing legal identity credentials to all is part of the peace and reconciliation process and necessary for more fair and equal distribution of state resources, which are often limited, as well as the participation in political processes. We must also recognize that this is an enormous task. It requires strong legal framework, institutions, and human capacity, and success goes beyond this. It also requires building trust with residents and with other government and private institutions. Let's not forget that governments also need data and statistics about their population. Si je veux peut être franc, le gouvernement ne peut pas répondre.
Honest, the government cannot answer the needs of people who do not exist officially. The governments need demographic statistics data to function efficiently. And individuals who cannot prove who they are cannot access the services that are established by the partners.
Officially publish it on our website in both English and French within the next couple of weeks. So please check our website regularly for these updates. With these few words, I will hand this session back to Jenna from the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data to introduce the presenters in today's session. I hope you enjoy it, and thank you very much for your participation and for the wonderful collaboration with our colleagues at the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. Back to you, Jenna.
Thank you, Montasser. That was an excellent framing and setting the scene on the issues and why they're important. As Montasser mentioned, the paper is available in English on the website, but it has also been posted in the documents section on Kudo right now. So if you go to the small gray button labeled documents, you can also download it. The French will be available quite soon, and you can also access it by visiting the Center of Excellence website at IDRC. And so let's move on to hear from Mia Harbitz, who will present and who will frame the study. Mia is an independent consultant in the area of identity management with an engineering background and extensive experience in civil registration and civil identification project management in developing countries. Over the course of a 25-year career with the Inter-American Development Bank, she has designed and managed development projects that modernized and strengthened the capacities of civil and identification registries. Over to you, Mia.
Thank you very much. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Unfortunately, my video does not work, so it would be just my voice, and Holly will be helping me with the projection of the slides. So, Holly, could you thank you. We were really excited to be given this opportunity to look into how countries deal with giving legal identity to all, and especially looking at countries where with particularly challenging circumstances like Afghanistan, Georgia, Rwanda, and South Africa. Next slide, please. The objective of the study the rationale behind the study is that there is broad agreement of the importance of the Sustainable Development Goals, and in particularly Goal 16.9, as this goal is key for to measure over 70 of the other indicators for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And despite mounting evidence of the need for people to have trusted and trustworthy identity credentials, regardless of citizenship or nationality, little systematic attention has been paid to the key elements of the identity management system that actually facilitates and establishes a person's unique legal identity and can also issue reliable official identity credentials. And on the other side of this is also overlooked very often when we speak about giving legal identity, is a country's ability to register and give legal identity to everyone who lives within its border, regardless of citizenship status. And I think there's really broad agreement also on the definition of what legal identity is, that it really starts with birth registration. So the objective was to analyze the role of the civil register, its operational capacities, and the legal underpinnings in each of the cases that would give identity, a legal identity to all in a post-conflict setting. Next slide, please. So the methodology, we had to improvise a little bit during the study because the COVID pandemic effectively canceled all planned travel to the different countries. So we based our report on available information online and in English. And this meant that we had somewhat of a language barrier with some of the documents that were only available in Georgian and in any of the languages of Afghanistan. And given the difficulties during this past year, we are really grateful to all of those who took time to share information and their experiences with us. And we appreciate how difficult this was also on the other end, because the team that was working on this, Diane is based in Namibia, I'm based in the US, and we had the help of a research assistant, Natalie Smith, who was based in Italy. So it's kind of an international effort. And given that government officials were dealing with really critical tasks under unusual and difficult circumstances, unfortunately, we were unable to interview anyone except the director of civil registration from Afghanistan. Next slide, please. So why these 4 countries? the selection of countries for the study may not immediately seem obvious. Afghanistan, Georgia, Rwanda, and South Africa. However, there are certain common elements between them. One is that the conflicts were mainly intrastate and consisted of fighting between ethnic or religious groups. Should make the note that in the case of Afghanistan, there has also been considerable external involvement in the conflict over decades. Another common element is that the root of each of these conflicts was resentment between groups and a certain ambition of individual groups. But even though there are group differences in countries, these only become worth fighting for if there are other important differences between groups, such as distribution of political or economic power. A third element is the failure of the social contract, in that the government is unable to deliver services and reasonable socioeconomic conditions, or delivers these selectively to a group, which then feeds into the group resentment. And lastly, even though they have had different types of conflicts, each of the countries have or are, in the case of Afghanistan, going through a peace and reconciliation process. And that also includes rebuilding institutions. And in each of these cases, the civil registry and the issuance of identity credentials, be those birth certificates or national identity cards, has been part of that process. And just to quickly, next slide please, just to quickly mention some of the barriers that these countries have had to deal with, is that depending on the length of the conflict, and the severity and the complexity of the challenges that must be faced through a process of reconciliation and state rebuilding, also varies. But the institutions, and perhaps in particular civil registration and civil identification institutions, have been most likely sidelined and most likely underfunded and disregarded during the conflict. And this has meant that registration has slowed down or halted completely. So once the institution is back up and running, there is an enormous backlog of individuals that have to somehow find a way to prove who they are, to prove citizenship, to get access to services and benefits. And this also has, the lack of registration also has caused a lack of vital statistics, which means that the countries, the states, do not necessarily know the size of each of the cohorts and have difficulties planning accordingly. Conflicts have created additional marginalized groups, such as internally displaced populations. There are cross-border flights, but people return, they have difficulties in proving the connection to a country, and then there is the lack and loss of identity credentials. All 4 countries of the studies have had these experiences. And another commonality between them is to get the register, both the civil register and the civil identification register in order. This has been a multi-year task. And lack of statistics is a challenge. Next slide, please. Unicef has been reporting on birth registration rates. And since 1980, they have published yearly the state of the world's children. From 2004 onwards, they added information on birth registration rates, and these data, as I understand it, have been obtained from the multiple indicator cluster surveys. So we have statistics from Afghanistan, Georgia, and Rwanda from 2004, and statistics from South Africa was incorporated from 2009. And of these 4 countries, Afghanistan has seen a significant increase, but the rates are still low. Rwanda has seen a decline, which is possibly connected to difficulty of accessing the services. And Georgia has seen a small dip, but is on par with most developed countries. One of the problems looking at countries who has been in conflict situations and are emerging from conflict situation is that it's very difficult to find reliable official statistics. And next slide, please. And what we have observed in many of these countries is that the state institutions, and here we just mapped some of the elements of identity management from birth registration, civil identification, issuance of cards, and access to to give people access to benefits and services, are often operating in silos with no interconnectivity or interoperability between them, which makes governance much harder. But to finish, some of the key observations from this study, if you will change this slide, please. With the goal of giving legal identity to everyone, the legal framework is really core, but it needs to operate almost in tandem with the institutional capacity. In many ways, it's a chicken and egg situation, but the conclusion that we have drawn from this study, and that Diane will elaborate, is that the legal framework is the basis for this. And upon that needs to be the institutional capacity. Technology is a tool, it's not a goal, and we have seen too many times that it's very easy to throw technology at the problems of under-registration without the institutional capacity to maintain it or the legal framework to ensure that whatever identity credential, be it a birth certificate, marriage certificate, death certificate, or identity card, can, for these to be trustworthy, you need to have a legal framework as the really key foundation of the system. So thank you for your attention. This was just a brief framing of the study, and we will go deeper into the legal framework in the next section. Thank you.
Thank you, Mia. That was an outstanding framing, really, really valuable to hear sort of what you found across these 4 very different countries, but also the similarities and the challenges that they're facing. So now we'll go over to hear about the key legal findings from Diane Hubbard. Diane Hubbard is the coordinator of the Gender Research and Advocacy Project at the Legal Assistance Center in Windhoek, Namibia. She has supported the legal drafting of Namibia's new civil registration and identification bill, as well as the new marriage bill. She has also served as the deputy chairperson of Namibia's Law Reform and Development Commission. So over to you, Diane.
Thank you. I'm speaking to you from my home in Namibia, so I hope that the internet will not let us down. We can go to the slideshow. Yes, thank you. So I think we can go ahead and move to the next slide. Mia has told you about the some of the commonalities in the 4 countries that we've selected. But when it comes to the legal system, I wanted to begin by highlighting some of the distinctions. Very, very different legal systems. Afghanistan, Georgia, and Rwanda all have civil law systems, by which I mean a law where the basic legal principles are codified. South Africa has a legal system that's based on Roman Dutch, which is also civil law, but it's been overlaid in modern times by common law, which means that although there are statutes that set out the legal principles, court rulings and court interpretations play a much larger role than in a civil law system. There are also major differences in religion. There's quite a spectrum. Afghanistan is established as an Islamic state. Georgia is a secular state, but it has a particular relationship with one specific church, whereas Rwanda and South Africa are, in terms of their constitutions, secular states. There's a very, very widely differing degrees of language and ethnic diversity. One of the most extreme is South Africa, which has 11 official languages in terms of the constitution. And another thing is that there are very different levels of detail about citizenship in the country's constitutions, from leaving all of the key principles to statute to setting out the basic basis for citizenship in the constitution. So I found it very, very interesting that despite these incredible diversity of these countries, that there were many, many commonalities. And this is something that we didn't choose the countries because they were all doing well or all having certain things in common. This is something that was very interesting because it came to light as we dug deeper after the initial selection. Okay, next slide. As Mia's already mentioned, all 4 countries had to deal with civil registration systems that were in some state of disarray. And one thing that I think is extremely interesting is that there have been law reforms in all 4 countries, a series of law reforms, not just in the initial stages after the conflict, but efforts to keep on improving and refining the civil registration and identification systems. And one thing that I was also struck by is that all 4 countries have chosen to have a single agency to administer both civil registration and identification. I think this is eminently sensible but it's not the standard everywhere in the world. And in Georgia and South Africa, citizenship is also administered by the same agency. That's not the case in the other two countries we studied. But I thought it's also very interesting that when you're starting from a state of disarray, it's an incredible challenge, as Mia has described, but it's also an opportunity. I think when you have a country that is consciously saying, let us remake ourselves, let us remake our systems, that's also a really exciting chance to try new things. Okay, next slide. The way I've organized my discussion after reflecting on it quite a lot is that I think that almost all of the key law reforms have all been moved toward greater inclusivity. And to talk a bit more about that, in all of the countries that we looked at, civil registration is not limited to citizens. ID documents can be, in Afghanistan, those are limited to citizens. And in the other three countries studied, citizens and non-citizens get different kinds of credentials. All four countries make explicit provision for IDs and travel documents for refugees. Well, I say all four, let me say, we struggle to find clear information about the position of refugees in Afghanistan. Also, all four countries have specific provisions for dealing with people who have no documentation, who've lost their documentation. This is important in many, many countries, but particularly in these post-conflict settings. The countries have handled this in different ways, which we'll discuss in a few minutes, but this need was recognized in all four countries. And one of the things that I think is still a bit of a struggle in these countries and in many others in the world is the issue of parentage of children born outside marriage. All four countries here that we studied have specific procedures for looking at that. And this can all, in many cases, take place after the initial birth registration, which I think is also a positive step because it means that any dispute about parentage in that situation is not going to be preventing the crucial fact of having documentation in place. So what I'd like to do, having identified some of the basic trends, is look at each of the four countries and highlight some of the things that we found particularly noteworthy or interesting in each country. So let's move to the next slide. Okay, thank you. In Afghanistan, the law is not entirely clear about civil registration for non-citizens. It's clearly available to citizens. And I was wondering if this was simply a matter of the English translations that we looked at. But a strategy document that was prepared inside the country notes that this is the case in the original law as well. It's not entirely clear. But some of the articles that have recently been written about civil registration in Afghanistan indicate that it's looking to the Aadhaar system in India for with the goal of having a more inclusive civil registration system. So the movement is definitely in the direction of inclusion. There are many, many people who don't have documentation about their age, their birth date, and so forth. And so Afghanistan has made particular provision that if someone is trying to register a birth or the birth of a person of any age, there's a procedure in the law for estimating age on the basis of statements and other estimates. So it's something that's readily acknowledged that not knowing one's specific birth date should not be a bar to civil registration. There's also a specific legal provision for dealing with children of unknown parentage, that such a child can be assigned a name and an identity. When it comes to ID cards, these date back to the early part of the last century in Afghanistan. They are available only to citizens. But if someone has no documentation, they can have, there's a procedure whereby two people who do have ID cards can guarantee their identity, so to speak. And then after a security check, they can be given an ID card as an Afghan citizen. One of the things that was particularly interesting about Afghanistan is they have quite an elaborate procedure for civil registration for Afghan citizens outside Afghanistan, which exist in very large numbers. And they also have creative provisions for providing IDs to the population they refer to as Kochi. I don't know if my pronunciation is correct. It's a nomadic population. And so they have explicit provision in the law for how you deal with identifying an address for someone who is a nomad. One of the big challenges that's been a topic of a lot of debate in Afghanistan recently is the gender gap in IDs. About twice as many men have IDs as women. And women, even more than that, women have been invisible in terms of legal identity in the past. Women's names, mothers' names did not appear either in civil registration records or on ID cards. But there was a very interesting campaign that came to a head in 2020. It was called the hashtag Where Is My Name? It was actually initiated by Afghan citizens living outside the country, but it was a demand for women to become visible on ID cards. And that has been successful. It's already happened with civil registration. And as of September last year, moves were underway to introduce mothers' names on the ID cards, which currently have only fathers' and grandfathers' names. But it's still going to be very challenging because surveys that have looked at why women don't have IDs, part of it relates to the structural attitudes about women in Afghanistan. Many women apparently stated that they see no reason why they should need to have an ID because of attitudes about women being involved in public life. It's also in some conservative communities, women don't feel that it's appropriate for their name to be known. So this is going to be a very interesting space to watch in Afghanistan. Okay, moving to the next slide, I'd like to talk a bit about Georgia now. Georgia is, I think, in some ways at the peak of inclusivity. Civil registration is available to anyone who's present in the country. And the law, interestingly, it specifically says, even someone who is illegally present in the country, by which I mean someone who has no legal permission to be present in Georgia, can still avail themselves of civil registration services. ID cards are also available to citizens. They get a particular national ID card. To residents who get a residence card, it can be of a different time frames can be involved. And refugees also get temporary residence cards. There's a very specific process for establishing what the law refers to as facts of legal significance, where someone's key documents have been lost or never existed in the first place. So basically, this is a procedure to establish the key information that is needed for civil registration. And as another example of inclusivity, there's also a specific procedure for issuing temporary ID numbers to homeless children while their process is underway to get proper documents so that they can avail themselves of social services. Another thing that Georgia does that I found that is quite interesting is even though the formerly autonomous areas of South Ossetia and, sorry, my pronunciations are terrible, Abkhazia, even though the previous authorities in these areas have never been recognized by Georgia, they do recognize the documentation from those areas for purposes of citizenship and civil registration. They also do a very good job at providing distance services. They have special sessions with sign language interpreters for persons who are hearing impaired, for example. And they have an interesting initiative that they refer to as one-stop shops. These are government offices that provide up to 200 services in one location. Apparently, in some of these one-stop shops, you can even go and have a cup of coffee while you're waiting for your turn with the government official. So they've really made some creative efforts to try to make civil registration and identification processes as accessible as possible. One of the challenges that they've been facing is civil registration in the minority Roma community, but they've made some specific efforts in this regard. And in the last year or two, apparently, the number of undocumented Roma has been decreasing. Let's move to Rwanda now. Rwanda is also an example of an extremely inclusive system. Again, like Georgia, civil registration and ID documents apply to everyone who's present in the country. You can have different cards, but citizens, residents, and refugees will all get identification documents and are able to register. Rwanda also has a detailed procedure for reconstructing missing or lost data. There's got to be an inquiry, and there needs to be court intervention to make sure that the fact is properly established. But the law specifically says that the court ruling can apply to multiple people. So, for example, if there are people who are similarly situated, the process is designed to be as streamlined as possible. When it comes to different groups, there are at the moment different population registers according to the law for citizens, non-citizens, children of unknown parents, and adopted children. And the civil registration and the ID processes are linked, as they are in most of the countries that we looked at. One of the things that was interesting about Rwanda is in 2016, they did a very comprehensive review of the civil registration system with different ministries being involved, with the very conscious idea that they wanted to refine the laws on the civil registration. And their major approach for trying to be to capture everyone in the country has been to have very highly decentralized services. Everyone in the country is very close to a civil registration office. Despite their efforts, birth registration fell, as Mia's chart showed a few minutes ago. And the diagnosis for the reasons for this was partly that the process was very difficult. And there were previously requirements that all civil registration had to have 2 witnesses. That proved to be a discouraging factor. And so the law has been reformed now. In many cases, witnesses are no longer required. They've also instituted public awareness campaigns. And this is not yet in the Unicef figures, but Rwanda's internal figures indicate that they believe that the coverage of birth registration in 2019 was 87%, which would make their graph go in the right direction. And now, fourthly, looking at South Africa. South Africa is also inclusive, maybe not quite to the extent of Georgia and Rwanda. Civil registration is available to anyone in the country, but the population register is limited to citizens and permanent residents. So it's only citizens and permanent residents who get the national ID documents. Refugees do get a refugee ID card, and they are also able to use civil registration services. The law has provision for birth registration of children of unknown parents. And again, civil registration and identification are tied together, that if you don't previously have birth registration and you apply for an ID card, then your identity will be entered into the population register at that stage. At least that's how the law describes it. One of the things that has enabled South Africa to increase its coverage for civil registration and identification in recent years is links with social grants. I think that's been the major factor. Also increased public awareness and an effort to move more into health facilities. So South Africa, as Mia said, has had a really remarkable increase in the coverage of birth registration. Unlike the other countries that we looked at, the reporting by health facilities of births and deaths is not yet incorporated into the relevant laws, although it is apparently happening on the ground. And one of the things that I found particularly interesting about South Africa as the only common law country was that courts have been involved in striking down some overly strict and discriminatory requirements for civil registration in recent years. For example, there was one case where a woman wanted to register the birth of her child in South Africa, but she didn't have documentation to prove that she was legally present in the country, because when her visa ran out, she was too heavily pregnant to travel back to her home country, the DRC, in order to get a new tourist visa. And so when her child was born, she had no documentation. So this case went to court, and the court found that it's unreasonable to require documentation from someone when it's impossible for them to obtain that documentation. So I think that was an important ruling. And there have also been a very interesting court case that the law at the moment says that only mothers can register the birth of children born outside marriage. And there was a court case where it was held that that doesn't make any sense, that if you have the proof of parentage, there's should be no bar to a father registering the birth of a child born outside marriage. Okay, next slide. You'll notice if you do download the paper, in each case, we've looked at civil registration and identification alongside citizenship, because it's really not feasible to talk about any one of the three issues without looking at how they are intertwined with the others. And civil registration is crucial to establishing the facts that are necessary to establish citizenship. As I mentioned, civil registration is open to non-citizens in all of the countries that we looked at, but it's important to delink birth certificates and citizenship to really promote inclusivity. And by this, I mean that a birth certificate can be relevant for the facts that establish citizenship, but it shouldn't be synonymous with citizenship, because then the impact can be that there may be a reluctance to give birth certificates to persons who are not citizens. One of the things that was very encouraging is all 4 countries make provision for citizenship for persons who would otherwise be stateless. And all of them make citizenship by naturalization available to refugees in theory, although in some cases there are practical barriers. I've listed some of these on the slide. I won't go through them, but the normal naturalization process sometimes has requirements that are particularly high hurdles for refugees to be able to achieve. It also can be a very long process. In South Africa, for example, a refugee would need to live in the country for at least 10 years before they would be able to attempt to get citizenship by naturalization. One of the things that we looked at in terms of, next slide, in terms of the linkages between citizenship identification and civil registration is in each of the countries we looked at, what does the law say about how you prove your citizenship? And here I think an interesting element was that many of the countries are becoming more diverse in how you prove your citizenship. In Afghanistan, the tazkira, the ID credential, is still the major element of proof of citizenship, but civil registration entries can also be used as proof in the absence of an ID card. In Georgia, you prove your citizenship with your ID card, with your original birth certificate if you're too young to have an ID, or with a passport. Rwanda has the broadest range of possibilities. Your proof of citizenship in terms of the law can be your birth certificate, a proof that's issued by the registrar of civil registration, a certificate of nationality, an ID card, a passport, or a citizenship certificate. So I think Rwanda's gone the farthest to recognize that people enter the system in different ways. In South Africa, the law says that the official proof of citizenship is a certificate of South African citizenship that's issued by the Minister of Home Affairs. But it appears that birth certificates are often still the documentation that people use in practice. Next slide. One of the things that was quite interesting in South Africa was that in 2018, South Africa officially considered new regulations which would have limited birth certificates to citizens only, to children of citizens. And the proposal was that there was going to be a confirmation of birth that would be issued to children of non-citizens, so that they could then go to their embassy or their high commission to get an actual birth certificate. When I say it was officially proposed, it was published in the Government Gazette for discussion. This proposal was not adopted. There were a number of objections, but I think it's illustrative of the fact that people still sometimes, officials still tend to have in many countries an idea that a birth certificate is evidence of citizenship as opposed to evidence of the facts of birth. It was beyond the scope of this study, but one of the things that I think would be really, really interesting would be to have a closer look at the procedures that are used for determining citizenship status. We touched on this in the paper, but it was not the focus. And one of the things that's, to me, extremely important is also, what do people do if they feel that the determination of citizenship is incorrect? I think it's very important that there needs to be an accessible appeal or review process. That is, reasonably within the reach of someone who feels that their citizenship status has been incorrectly determined. And then let's go to the next slide. Moving to a somewhat different topic, it was very interesting to see that in all 4 of the countries studied, there is a move toward stronger and stronger linkages with information from medical facilities. In Afghanistan, both state and private health facilities have a legal duty to report births and deaths. This has had somewhat of a lesser effect than in the other countries studied, because about half of all births in Afghanistan still take place at home, as opposed to in a medical facility. Georgia has moved very far in this direction. They have direct electronic transmission from health facilities to the Civil Registration Agency. And this has been something that's been credited with the great improvement in prompt birth registration in Georgia. Rwanda also is moving toward changing the focus of birth and death registration to information from health facilities. South Africa, as I mentioned, has not yet formally incorporated the role of health facilities into the law, but there is information sharing between the relevant ministry and medical facilities as a mechanism to combat fraud. And South Africa is also in the process of setting up birth registration points in health facilities. What we thought we would do at this stage, I've covered quite a lot of ground. We thought we'd have a little pause to talk about any questions, take a few questions at this stage just to see what you're finding interesting. And we'll have a little pause for that, and then I'll continue with the last few points in the presentation.
Thanks so much, Diane. Jenna here. So I am happy to pass some questions to Diane at this stage. Feel free to put them into the chat. If I don't see any jumping out right now, I'm ready with a couple of questions that we can jump to. So let me just start, Diane, with putting a question to you about the relationship between the determination of citizenship and registration. So you mentioned that birth registration should be delinked from the determination of citizenship to ensure inclusivity. Do you have an example of a country that has done this successfully? And what were the key factors that enabled this success?
I don't really have an example that I think is a good model. One thing that's been put on the table in Namibia hasn't been accepted yet. An idea that is on the table for discussion is to have where citizenship is unclear, citizenship status, that there could be a presumption of citizenship that has to be disproved by government, with the idea there being that it's very difficult for people who don't have legal background, maybe even people who are not literate. It's going to be very difficult for somebody with no documentation and no resources to establish citizenship in difficult cases. And so the idea here would be that the presumption would operate to say, well, we are going to treat you as a Namibian citizen unless Namibia can prove that you do not qualify to be a citizen. And that proposal was actually a reaction to reluctance in Namibia to issue birth certificates to children born to non-citizens, even though officially birth registration in Namibia is simply supposed to be a record of the facts of birth. What the law says and what happens in practice, it's a bit like what happens in South Africa. There's still a sense that if you have a birth certificate issued by Namibia, that somehow gives you an indication of citizenship. So I don't have an example of being an ideal, but I think the discussion of this Namibian possibility could be very interesting. I hope maybe some other people in the discussion may have some examples to offer there.
Yeah, that's great. And if anyone does want to share examples, feel free to use the chat for that as well. Everyone can look at the chat and we can have a bit of an written interactive exchange. Just a quick reminder that at the top left of your screen, you can flip to live video to see the speaker rather than the intermission page of the presentation. So, Diane, another question or comment that we had in the chat was around a possible explanation for the decline in numbers of birth registration in Rwanda, which was around a kind of initial broad understanding of what registration meant in Rwanda, encompassing everything from vaccination to a whole range of other steps. That sort of definition was then more clearly defined around the vital event of birth, and then with that clearer definition, then the numbers went down following that. And I'm wondering if you saw that in your study, or how you react to that comment.
That's very interesting. That's not something I came across, but me and I both noticed that different sources in many instances had different statistics. So it was very difficult to know which ones to cite in terms of trends and so forth. So that explanation is extremely interesting. It was one of the limitations by not being able to actually visit the countries that we were studying. And as Mia mentioned, in many cases, we were not able to do remote interviews with government officials. It was sometimes very difficult to go behind, written material that we had to base the report on primarily.
Great, thank you. Well, it's very interesting to hear that explanation coming through from one of the participants, and worth looking into further. So we've had another question around international recognition of registration done by non-state actors. And so the earlier question posed, I think this was Niall McCann, about whether about the challenges around that, and particularly then asking about documents issued by South Ossetia and Abkhazia. You noted that the government of Georgia recognized those registration documents, but also wondering about that international recognition of documents issued by non-state actors, or registration issued by non-state actors, and what challenges that may pose.
This is not something we specifically looked at in Georgia, but my understanding from the reading of the law was that you could, I don't know if converted is the right word, but that you could officially register with the Georgian government on the basis of the documentation by the authorities that Georgia had not otherwise recognized. So I think there was the possibility for entering the Georgian system on that basis, which would have taken care of the international recognition. But again, there may be someone who's with us today who can give more clarity on that than I'm able to.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Are there any other questions we want to pose to Diane now, or I'm just looking at the chat. I have some others, but what I'll do is I'll hold on to those for our Q&A later on then, Diane, and maybe just hand it back over to you to the presentation to continue with the final slides.
Okay, thank you. So let's move to the next slide then. One of the points that kept coming back to me was that in almost everything that we looked at, both within the 4 countries we were studying and more general analyses, I think everyone pays more attention to birth than to death. And yet proper registration of death is as vital as birth registration when it comes to accurate legal identity systems. It was much harder to get figures about death registration, much less detail about how it worked. We know that it's often weaker than birth registration in many countries around the world. In the countries we were looking at, in Afghanistan, birth registration is simply not common unless it's needed for something very specific, such as an inheritance dispute. It's not required for disposal of the body. Rwanda also had, compared to its birth registration, very low death registration, estimated at 31% of all deaths in 2019. Georgia has very good death registration. They estimate 91%. And that's due to online death registration procedures, links to medical facilities, and also law reforms to improve registration procedures. South Africa's death registration is also high, and that's because you have to register a death in order to get a burial order for disposal of the body. And there's specific provision that funeral undertakers, which are used in many funerals, are actually take care of the death registration for the family. Next slide. But if you look a bit wider than just the countries that we looked at, just to give an example, in Africa, only 1 in 3 deaths is officially registered. Sorry, I'm on the next slide now. Thanks. The laws were typical in that the provisions on death registration tended to be less detailed than the ones on birth registration. But what seems to be, what came out of this study as being positive practices is to have clear legal duties for who's supposed to register the death, involving medical institutions, as is already happening in birth registration. As mentioned, links between death registration and disposal of the body. And also something that we looked at least in the background, I don't think it made it into the final paper, but that was whether or not there were legal provisions in each of the countries we looked at for declaring missing persons dead after an appropriate time period and usually with court intervention. And I highlight this because I think that can be particularly important in post-conflict situations. And you can imagine for the individuals involved, if you don't have such a procedure, then the family is in a kind of a limbo. There are problems with inheritance, particularly for women. There may be an inability to remarry. So these presumptions of death proceedings are very, very important. And they tended to be present in the countries we looked at. Okay, next slide. One of the things that I also found particularly interesting personally in the countries we looked at is how you really have to look into the historical context to understand what's happening in a country presently. In Rwanda and South Africa, because race and ethnicity on IDs were in the past used as a basis for discrimination and worse, these would never appear on the IDs now. I mean, I think that goes without saying. But there was a very interesting debate in Afghanistan in 2020. There's a difference of opinion amongst members of the public about what the term Afghan means, whereas the Constitution looks at it as being a neutral term that simply describes being a citizen of Afghanistan. Historically, it was associated with a particular ethnic group in Afghanistan, the Pashtun group. And so because of that, recently, there was a public demand that because ID cards simply said Afghan, people wanted ethnicity to appear on the face of the ID card, interestingly, along with religion. There was a lot of debate about this, and the public demands for this led to law reform that now ethnicity and nationality and religion, all three appear on the face of the ID card, which would make no sense without the historical context that I've described. And then Georgia, we've already talked about that it has put the interest of individuals above the political issues that are still to some extent unresolved. So I think that context is one of the most interesting things in the study that we did. And then I'd like to move on to the next issue now, and that's data protection. In case there's anyone participating who's not familiar, this refers to the appropriate and secure handling of personal information that's collected for civil registration and IDs. And there was quite a spectrum with the 4 countries that we looked at. Afghanistan has no law on data protection at the moment, not that we could locate. Rwanda is just about to pass one. It's at a final stage, but as of the end of last year, it hadn't yet been passed. South Africa has a relatively new data protection law. Well, it's been in place for a while, but it's only recently had most of its provisions coming into force. And Georgia is the farthest along the spectrum. The Constitution safeguards personal information in official records against disclosure without either specific consent or legal authority based on public interest. But one of the things that was striking to me is that when we were researching this, we didn't really come across any demands from the public for improved data protection. And this is particularly interesting in light of the fact I mentioned a minute ago. There are public demands for many other things about IDs. You know, it's not that the public is not interested in civil registration and ID issues. But I think maybe in this context, my theory is that because the real point of civil registration and an identification document is for people to use those documents to prove those facts to others. Perhaps that's why data protection is not emerging in this area in the same way that it may be in other capacities. But, you know, we found, despite the existence of data protection laws or draft laws in many of the countries, I didn't really find a lot of literature or public advocacy around that issue. Again, this may be something that other people can point us to. And then finally, we tried to look at issues related to COVID. It's impossible not to be thinking about COVID when we did the time period that we did this study, but we also thought that maybe that would be an example of how civil registration and ID issues are done during times of all kinds of disasters and challenges. And the interesting outcome was that, at least in Georgia, Rwanda, and South Africa, all three of those countries considered some civil registration activities to be essential public services, and they provided special procedures to keep at least some activities going during the pandemic. I was struck in particular by Georgia because they had a legal enactment that they put forward early on in the pandemic, and it offered some very specific procedures, online bookings, possibility of sending documents back and forth by post in context where this was not normally allowed, virtual services that they offered in some cases. They had staff who would go out to people, elderly persons and persons with mobility issues. They basically did house calls during the pandemic for certain civil registration services. They allowed virtual oral hearings electronically for some administrative proceedings, or dispensed with oral hearings in other cases. And they have a commission that looks at applications for citizenship, and that was arranged that that commission could meet electronically during the height of COVID. So I just thought that it was really interesting that Georgia found civil registration to be so important that they had this diversity of mechanisms that they used to try to keep it going as much as possible. So that brings us to the end of my summary. And so I hope that maybe we'll have some more questions to bring out other issues now. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Diane. That was fascinating and very comprehensive. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go over to hear from our discussant, Jonathan Claren, who is a professor at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. He works in the areas of competition and regulation, access to justice, law and migration, and socio-legal issues. He served as the dean of the Wits Law School from 2010 to 2013, and as director of the school's Mandela Institute from 2005 to 2007. And in 2016, he served as an acting judge on the High Court of South Africa. His most recent book is called From Prohibited Immigrants to Citizens, The Origins of Citizenship and Nationality in South Africa. So a lot of experience with this topic. Jonathan, we'd love to hear your reflections on the study and the presentations from Mia and Diane. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jenna. Yeah, I'll speak. I think I'll have 3 or 4 comments to make in about 10 minutes, but thanks very much to IDRC and to the CVRS Center of Excellence for their support for the report and for this opportunity to comment. And thanks to Mia and Diane for the research and the writing of it. Okay, so part of my first comment is to say I really enjoyed reading the report twice, 2 fois. I read it as part of a review and again before here. But I think that means that I really would encourage everyone here to download, to read, and use this report. I will be doing that. I have done that. I think the report is rich and detailed and professionally accomplished and informed. one of the really key positive aspects of the method and the scope was to specifically be looking at refugee and marginal populations as part of the topic. And I thought that was a really good feature that was carried through. And there's a lot in this report that hasn't been mentioned. We have had a comprehensive presentation, but I think maybe one aspect that hasn't been able to come out so much is there's really a lot of historical background here, particularly of the CRVS system. So one example is the three-stage history of the reform and the modernization of the CRVS system in Georgia, which involves both professionalization and moving from kind of one form of centralization to another form of centralization within the governance system. We did get a mention of, for instance, the interesting history of the term Afghan, which I also had not appreciated before this report. So there's really a lot in the report, and I'd encourage everyone to download and use it. So second, I think it's interesting to place this report within the sort of broader field of research on the CRVS system and development studies and comparative public administration even. So as the CRVS Center of Excellence itself indicates, there's a concept here, which is that you can go to a country and look at the concept of the CRVS, the Civil Registration Vital Statistics System, and this has been developed. And as I understand it, that really works on the linkage of the civil registration element and the national identification element. And the report makes this clear that it's those two, which can be different things, and are both distinct from citizenship, but that those two, civil registration and the national identification, are a key part of this system. But that's not all of the system. It really, that system, which is looked at in each of these countries, can and often does include vital statistics. So that's why we talk about birth and death, and also the health system. My sense is, I'd be interested to hear Mia and Diane's views as well as others, that in a way the health is a little bit the later field or concept to come into this system. So there's more variability in the degree to which the vital statistics and the health information systems are linked into what we are actually looking at, what is common across these four case studies. Okay, so a third comment is I'd like to take a step back for a little bit. So I'm a lawyer, but I'm also a sociologist. So while I very much appreciate the look at the legal framework together with the bureaucracy and the administration in each of these systems, but just to step back a little bit from that, I think what we need to do, and I think the report helps us to do this, is to look at citizenship together with civil registration and identification. I think there's really a three-part movement happening there globally in a kind of policy way. First is that citizenship, the idea of predicating services or policy on the attribute of citizenship itself, is gaining strength. So whether it's protectionism or exactly what in face of globalization, for instance, but there's an increasing salience of citizenship. Then secondly, which the next movement works a little bit against that first one, but as this report helps us see, the field of identification and national identification is not limited to citizens, but includes others as well. So we have permanent residents, we have refugees, etc. So I think the implication there is that the distinction becomes maybe increasingly those like citizens who have these ID documents and those who don't. And the report recognizes that. So at one point, I think it's in Afghanistan, that there's nearly 12 million persons without the Tazira cards. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. My apologies. Okay, so that's the second part of the movement. The third, though, is that we have to kind of take the focus broader and think about what is the use of the picture that's given in the core system, how much inclusion is happening. And really here we're thinking of not only the achievement of SDG 16.9, but all the other SDGs as well. So I think there, I want to point to some of what the formal legal frameworks leave out. So this isn't the direct focus of the report, but I think it's important to make as a comment, as a contextual comment, because there really are many residents who would be temporary or undocumented who may theoretically be able to get access into the CRVS system, which is part of, or at least the identification part of, well, more easily able to get into the civil registration and theoretically get, under certain circumstances, into the ID part. But that, but this doesn't necessarily mean that the potential for inclusion means that there is inclusion in terms of social citizenship at the moment. So there we need to, I think that's maybe the difference between sort of formal potential coverage and de facto coverage. It's also the distinction between what's often termed foundational systems and functional systems, the actual delivery of services through social protection or other fields. It could also include health. Okay, so that's the third comment about citizenship and those three movements. The last one is about the conflict framing in this report. So the conflict framing, well, the framing of conflict and post-conflict was chosen for the report, and I think that's worthwhile. Just like wars make states, the report makes a good case that conflicts make, or are at least very influential in the shaping of these systems, of the CRVS system. So while not perfect, the post-conflict theme does pull together these four country cases, which are otherwise far apart. Still, though, I think we need to ask the question of how the report helps with the elements that make up these systems, the legal identity and the bureaucratic elements and practices. So how does this research support countries who are dealing with similar situations? This is my brief. So I think there really are two more questions we have to ask there. What is to be supported and what is similar? So I'll go back to the beginning then, when we define what we're talking about of CRVS systems. And as the report does, appropriately in the beginning, it says we're looking at the bureaucratic practices, the agencies, and the legal frameworks, and particularly references the international legal frameworks, although obviously most of the report talks about the national frameworks. So I think it's important to distinguish between those two, or between two things: the international law and standards on legal identity, and the institutional structures. So one way to ask this is to say, is this report helping to build the institutions that provide for legal identity, or is it helping to be clearer towards understanding in maybe a legal and a common way what legal identity is? I think Mia actually started at the beginning by saying, I think her focus is maybe more on the institutions, saying that there is a common understanding there of the notion of legal identity. So one can ask, is the report helpful for changes and clarification at the level of, say, the international law or standards of legal identity, or changes in the institutions implementing that identity? I think my reading the report is it's really more helpful for the second one. You know, this is great for understanding what to be doing about institutions by having other examples and best practices and helpful analysis of what happened in certain places and where those rules came from through the historical background. So I guess what I would say in that part, in relation to the conflict framing, is that it might be, in the next report, it might be helpful to bring less variability into the types of conflicts that these different cases were addressing, and if they were more institutionally similar or were more similar to begin with in that institutional sense, then it would probably be more helpful towards supporting the research of comparative institutional building. Okay, so thanks again, and I look forward to hearing some of the questions and comments as the debate keeps going. But congratulations to Diane and Mia.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan, for those reflections. Really very thoughtful and very helpful. At this stage, I have a few questions to pose back to Diane and Mia, but I would also invite them to react to anything you heard from Jonathan, if you noted down some comments that you want to make. We don't have too many questions coming in the chat, and I would also invite participants to put more questions into the chat. Let me now just pose one question to each of you, Diane and Mia, and allow you also to reflect on Jonathan's comments. So for Mia, let me ask you, what are the 3 key findings from this research that you would like countries and other partners and actors to take specific notice of in terms of implications, either for future research or future policy work? And second, for Diane, I wonder if you can highlight whether any of the countries you looked at require unregistered adults to register for a birth certificate before they can register for an ID document. And if yes, is there a legal rationale for that? So why don't we go over to Mia first and then Diane, please.
Thank you, Jenna. And thank you, Jonathan, for your comments. Very constructive, very helpful. To pick up on your question, Jenna, and something that Jonathan said, one of the components of an identity management system that is not fully recognized and not fully used is the health information systems when it comes to reporting on vital events like births and deaths that occur in hospitals or in health institutions. That is one of the aspects that a lot of countries are missing out on, that the reporting of these events, both to the civil registration institution and to the statistical agencies. This is important for, ensuring that the correct registration is carried out, and also linking a newborn to parents, and also ensuring that the statistics are being entered in the system immediately. Another aspect that to me is really important, and that Jonathan also brought up, how much inclusion is actually happening. And what is important is that all births are registered immediately after they happen, so that the child will have a birth certificate, which, as Diane said, is not necessarily synonymous with citizenship, but it is synonymous with having an identity and a legal identity. So that is another aspect, immediate registration of the birth after it occurs, in line with the International Convention on the Rights of the Child, that now just a few countries have not signed or ratified. And a third point, I think it's important, is to follow international standards when it comes to creating databases, when it comes to managing the databases, when it comes to instituting both verification and authentication processes. So people, regardless of citizenship, will have access to both services and benefits that will include them or give them the socioeconomic conditions to participate in society wherever they live. So these are my 3 points. Thank you. Over to you, Diane.
Thank you. The one thing that occurred to me, I agree with what Jonathan said in his third point, that probably what comes out of the paper is much more helpful at the country level than at the international level. But one thing that we didn't particularly emphasize, but one thing I was struck by that we could have teased out, is that the international documents on refugees and statelessness seem to be influencing what countries were doing in a very practical sense. Again, I don't know, I can't say for sure what's happening on the ground, and I agree with him that what the law says is not always what happens in practice. But I think that the law is a starting point for what happens on the ground. It's an advocacy tool, even if it's not fully realized. But several of the documents that we looked at talked about how the conventions on statelessness and refugees had influenced law reform in the specific countries that we looked at. So I know you were talking about the other way around, but I found it quite a positive thing that international standards are filtering down in meaningful ways to what happens in the specific countries. Unfortunately, I had a technical difficulty on my side, and I missed the first part of the commentary from Jonathan. So if there's anything I should maybe be specifically commenting on from that part, please point me there. But to move to the question, the specific question that was posed to me was about basically the linkages between birth registration and ID documents. I think that in some ways, it doesn't even make sense to talk about the question separately, because there is, in most countries, a single agency now that's dealing with this. The Register for Identification and the Register for Civil Registration, those databases are one and the same. So I wouldn't say that it was necessarily a prerequisite, but in many cases, it appeared from the law that if you want to get an ID, because those IDs are separated into citizens and residents and refugees, information about birth is almost required to figure out what the ID should say. Again, I know I may be contradicting what I was saying before about trying to delink them, but the birth certificate, the birth registration is information about the facts of a person's identity that are relevant to the ID card. So what I thought was perhaps the most important thing is not trying to stop the trend of those processes coming to be unified, but the fact that most of that the countries that we looked at all made allowances for people who lack documentation. And I think it's also the way I often talk about it in Namibia is about breaking the chain. That if you keep not allowing people to register, it's self-perpetuating. Then their children will have trouble registering because the parents have no legal identity. So I think that that seems to be something that more and more countries are coming to a recognition, that you allow people to register even with imperfect documentation or facts. And one of the things we found is many people in Afghanistan have listed the 1st of January as being their birth date when they don't know what their actual birth date is. But my feeling is that's fine. Assign someone a birth date, assign someone the information that's necessary to allow the registration, because then you don't have self-perpetuating documentation problems for the children who are born to those undocumented parents. And it seems to me that that's a trend that we certainly saw in all 4 of the countries we looked at, is to try to break that chain of endless undocumentation.
Thank you, Diane and Mia, for those reflections. I think Diane and Jonathan, the point about whether practice at the country level may influence global standards and processes, or the other way around, whether global standards are influencing activity at country level, is an area for perhaps further additional research, because it may tell actors like the Center of Excellence, UN agencies and others, what direction or the directions of influence and whether and how best to sort of help countries. Likely it's both directions, but understanding the influence, the directions of influence could be very interesting from a sort of policy advocacy perspective, if you will. Now I'd like to ask both Mia and Diane a question about gender. And specifically, did you observe any specific gender barriers to the registration of vital events or, issuing of identity documentation in the different countries? You did highlight some cultural challenges with respect to Afghanistan a little bit in the presentation, but perhaps you could dig in a little bit more in the gender dimensions of the research, or what you found. Thank you. Diane, why don't you go first?
Okay, thank you. Well, I think in Afghanistan, as I spoke about, the problem is both in the laws on civil registration and identification, which are in the process of being changed, but they're really rooted in the position of women in society. So I think that's going to be a slow road. For women need to feel that it's important for them to have their own legal identity before they're going to ever be on a par with men in terms of possession of identity documents. But I'm happy to say that in the other countries that we looked at, I think the main area of difficulty is for children who are born outside marriage. And as I said, there are procedures whereby paternity can be added later, whereby a child can be registered without the father necessarily being identified. But I think that those things are also intertwined with social practices, and that's an area that what the law says and what happens on the ground is probably still far apart. And so again, we didn't have the capacity to go more deeply into that. But I think that could be an interesting focus of a study on its own, is that the difficulties that women in particular face when they're trying to either confront officials to register a child without a father's name trying to assemble proof of paternity, and also the social discouragement of that in some countries. That's something we didn't have information about. But again, I know from my own country that even if it's legally possible to register a child only in the name of the mother, if the father's not cooperating and there's not that proof of paternity, that's something that a lot of people don't feel comfortable doing, even though the law allows them to do that. And I think South Africa, as I mentioned, there was the court case there, that the South African law on its face actually particularly discriminated against men, which was interesting. The law simply didn't, some of these laws predate DNA testing. And I think that is really the source of the problems in the laws. I know the South African law, I think that particular provision dates back to the 1960s, that mothers are supposed to always register children born outside marriage, because once upon a time, the question of paternity couldn't be proved. So I think that around the world, there's probably a lot of work to be done with trying to catch up both with the new possibilities for scientific proof, but even more importantly, the social acceptance of women registering children born outside marriage on their own with or without a father's name. So I think that's the area where we're most likely to see gender problems, but we didn't really explore that in depth in this particular paper.
Okay, thanks, Diane. And Mia, why don't you come in with a response on that? Or I think we have another question in the chat around the link between civil registration and identity documentation in the countries that of the study.
Yes, thank you, Jenna. I think Diane covered the gender aspect of the registration processes and procedures. When it comes to the linkage between legal identity and vital statistics, we had problems getting access to good statistics. Like Diane said in her presentation, the fact that we weren't able to visit the countries limited the information that we could access and use for this project or for this report. And yes, that is a really important aspect, that statistics are not being well maintained during conflict, and rebuilding that public service after a conflict may not always be on the top of the list of priorities in a post-conflict situation. But that said, this is there's increasing recognition of the importance of linking health information systems for notification procedures with civil registration and the national statistical institutions to be able to have timely and high quality vital statistics available for public policy development, project planning and development, and governance. So this was kind of a long-winded way of saying that we were not able to dive as deeply as we would have liked into this aspect and get the information that we would have liked to have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mia. And now I'd like to turn to a question we received in the chat. For anyone who wants to sort of read it through, is under the technical support tab. And it asks, the question is asking about, how to support countries in meeting their obligations or their commitments under the Global Compact on Migration. And the specific text is referenced there, but effectively what's being highlighted in the question is the idea or the commitment to ensure all migrants have proof of legal ID and adequate documentation, including ascertaining a migrant's ID on entry to a given country or territory, as well as the adequate documentation that would enable access to services and other needs. And so I wonder if you might be able to reflect, both of you, on how the study might provide some indication on meeting those commitments under the Global Compact for Migration. These countries that experience significant conflict also experience significant movement of people. Those phenomena often come together. So perhaps we'll go to Mia first this time, and then Diane. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, this is very relevant for this compact on migration. We didn't particularly look into movement as such. It was more how to ensure that migrants coming to the country, returning, or internally displaced populations being given a legal identity in these 4 countries, and less about movement to other countries and how these other countries receive them. There is information on this, particularly I think we looked at reports from the Norwegian Refugee Council about the conditions of Afghan refugees in Pakistan, and but it was, our take on it was more the difficulties the refugees had with accessing registration services from Afghanistan, rather than how Pakistan treated this migrant population. But Diane, maybe you have, from the legal perspective, can complement.
Yes, we didn't look at particularly what information was collected about temporary migrants. But one thing that I thought was useful is that I believe, in Georgia and Rwanda, if I'm not misremembering it at the moment, the resident cards also applied to temporary residents. So I think that's a positive measure for migrants, that even a temporary residence in the country in Georgia and Rwanda could get you a temporary residence card that would be recognized while you were in those 2 countries. South Africa, in contrast, limits the ID cards to, if you're not a citizen, you must be a permanent resident or a refugee in order to get an official ID card. So, but one thing we did not look at is what kind of information the migrant had to provide in order to get that temporary residence card. But so I think that's some positive news, but I can't really shed any more light on that.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And another area, digging into a set of countries is interesting. Thinking about further research is perhaps looking at contiguous countries and how they address some of these issues, which touch on the movement of peoples. Well, we're coming close to the end, but before we hear our concluding remarks from Montasser, I'd like to give Mia and Diane 1 or 2 minutes each just to offer us your final thoughts or final takeaways from this study, and what do you want participants in this webinar to really remember or to focus on when they read the report. Maybe we'll start with you, Diane, and then go over to Mia.
Okay, I can think of 2 things that jump out for me. One of them is, the thing that I found the most interesting is how people bridge the gap between the law and what's on the ground. And the example, I mean, to give an example of what I mean, it's like the one-stop shops that we talked about in Georgia. To me, part of what's interesting is, yes, you have to have a good legal foundation, but then you have to be sure that people are going to use that law. And I think that is something that wasn't the main focus of the study, but I think that's something that to me is the reality behind the statistics. When there have been good uptake of civil registration and identification services, I think it's usually because of these things like public awareness campaigns, like social grants, like many different aspects of accessibility. So that's one thing that I found particularly interesting. The other thing is, I note with discouragement what I understood Jonathan to say about countries trying to limit more and more services to citizens. But the flip side of that is I definitely see in this group of post-conflict countries, definite moves toward law reform aimed at greater inclusivity in the civil registration and ID systems. And I also found that to be something that's really significant and important, that while there may be on other fronts things of saying, well, this is only for our citizens, this service is not for everyone, at least legal identity is something that I feel, particularly in post-conflict societies, is something that people appreciate the value of, the importance of, and it's something that you can clearly see if you look at the detail of the law reforms. Inclusivity has been a clear goal, and so that's something that I also found to be a very positive takeaway, and it's something that I hope that we'll be seeing in not only in post-conflict countries, but more generally.
Well, let me use the inclusivity as a segue to what my two takeaways, or what I would like people to look at. And inclusivity depends on institutions to really provide services, provide benefits, and respect rights, both human and civic rights. And institution building is really a part of governance, and hopefully good governance. And this is something that these 4 countries have tried to achieve. And another important aspect is actually the cultural, sociocultural facet of achieving universal registration. And that is a respect for cultural practices, making information available in the languages. And each of these countries, there are multiple languages being spoken by different ethnic groups. And one of the barriers to inclusion and to be registered is actually language. Information is not being made available, and cultural practices are not being respected. But again, this is also something that these 4 countries have tried to come to terms with and incorporate in their legal framework and how services are delivered. So thank you.
Thank you, Mia. And thank you, Diane. Really interesting and helpful sort of food for thought as we close up. Now I'll hand it over to Montasser to offer some concluding remarks. Please, Montasser.
Thank you so much, Jenna, and thank you very much our speakers and the participants who have asked the questions. Really a very interesting session today, webinar, and we sincerely hope that you have enjoyed the presentations and that they have provided you with new insights for work on these issues in conflict and post-conflict settings. I would like to reiterate that there are no quick and easy solutions, as we started at the beginning earlier. or one size, and there's no one size that fits all models for governments that want to achieve the goal of legal identity for all and universal birth registration as set out in SDG 16.9, or those who want to modernize their civil registries and identity management systems to enhance their service levels. The experience of the four countries featured in this new paper offer examples of different approaches governments can take to strengthen their systems to varying degrees. So adaptation and flexibility are key concepts. But also, nevertheless, all the approaches should be driven by the principle of inclusion, done through cooperation between government agencies, the removal of barriers to registration through legal and regulatory review and reform, and institution strengthening and interoperability with other private and public institutions. The most important ingredient, however, is ensuring and building political will for an equal and just society and a genuine appreciation and understanding of the pivotal role of civil registry, the civil registry plays in public governance and administration, and for reconciliation in post-conflict settings. We hope that the presentation has substantiated the beneficial relationship between civil registration, social development, and reconciliation, but it is evident that these topics warrant further exploration and empirical research. This is where the role of the Center of Excellence comes in. Le mandat du Centre d'Excellence est de commander, développer, soutenir et synthétiser les connaissances sur le système ESSEC. Et je vous encourage à visiter notre bibliothèque de ressources en ligne. Ceci peut être trouvé sur notre site web sous bibliothèque et apprentissage à www.systemessec.ca en français ou www.crvssystems.ca in English. Nous avons également récemment lancé un répertoire d'experts en ligne où vous pouvez rechercher et contacter des experts dans le domaine des systèmes ESSEC. Si vous recherchez une expertise ou si vous êtes vous-même un expert avec des compétences à partager, veuillez visiter www.repertoireessec.org or www.crvsdirectory.org. Thank you very much for the presenters, Mia, Diane, Professor Claren, and others for sharing your knowledge and experience today. Thank you also for Jenna from our, I say, dear sister partnership, Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, for moderating this webinar. And of course, thanks to all of you for joining. And we look forward to seeing you again in future webinars and events. Have a great day and afternoon and evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.